Good afternoon. It is so good to be able to see you, and I hope that you are enjoying your post-lunch coma. And I'm here to provide some indication of what it takes for us to rebuild local prosperity in our communities, and really to stress the idea that we need a bottom-up approach to doing so. And so before we begin, I was just curious to sort of get a sense of the room. How many of you have had the idea of strong towns or heard of strong towns and had it on your radar? Put up your hands if you have. A pretty decent number. All right, good. And then we've got others that perhaps this will be your first introduction to it, though certainly it won't be your first introduction to the core ideas that we're talking about and the issues that we're grappling with. I come today from Delta, British Columbia, where I live with my wife and my son, where we are active in our community. But what I'm excited about is that I was driving by some of the trees that I planted years ago in the midst of a lot of sweat and blood and curses on the hills outside of Kamloops, as well as other areas throughout the southern BC region. And it is good to be back. It's good to be at the scene of the crime, as it were. What we are really focused on in our communications with communities all across North America and increasingly in other parts of the world is that the prevailing pattern of development that we have adopted is making our places weak and fragile. And so Strong Towns, as a member-supported nonprofit organization, we have over 6,000 members now. We have over 500 official members in Canada that are participating in this project of getting word out that we seek to change that. 5 simple but audacious words that we set before ourselves. And we'll touch on what it means for us to face the fact that we are seeing our places become weak and fragile. But I want to introduce it in the context that for you as city leaders will really resonate with what you're doing. The reality is, you may be elected to a 3-year or 4-year term, you may be on your 5th term in a row, and you begin to realize that the movement of time for your community is very significant. Things take a while and require a lot of resources in order to make some progress. And we can liken that to a charity curling match, where the intent of the match is not simply to run in the regular amount of time and the same number of ends as you normally would, but instead say go for 3 days. If I'm getting ready for a game that's going to last for 3 whole days with my teammates, we are adopting a very different strategy up front. We are going to be committed to sweeping, yes, but not as vigorously on the first shot or as the last shot. We're going to be welcoming new people to come onto our team to help us. We're going to be looking for ways to gather up enough energy and resources to be able to sustain us as we go. And we talk about this in the distinction between a finite game, like 3 periods of a hockey game and you have a winner and they are exhausted by the end of it, versus an infinite game, where you need to have your community endure. Your team needs to make it through not just one generation, but many. And the challenge that we see in a lot of our places is that we actually pursue some rather high-risk strategies that use up a lot of our resources, and then we find ourselves exhausted. These are the types of boom and bust cycles that we see a lot of communities struggling with, and will increasingly see even more places struggling with. And so our core message at Strong Towns, and I think it actually echoes a lot of what we have heard council members and others even campaigning on these ideas. We've had mayors and city council members actually just say, I'm a Strong Towns candidate where I live. That was the case in Medicine Hat, for example, in Cochrane and other places, saying we care about these issues because our path that we're on, which was meant as a means of securing prosperity for all, has unwittingly trapped us in a system that is incapable of building lasting prosperity. Again, it's not maliciously trapped us. It's not that a bunch of people have been hoodwinked. It's that we've thought this was a good, noble, sincere, ideal quest to make our places happy and vibrant and healthy. And yet, one of the challenges that we have is that we have run up bills that we cannot, in the present, cover, let alone in the days that are to come. Sort of imagine if I went to a restaurant today and I ate well. I had lobster, I had steak for seconds, and then I had a great dessert and the finest bottle of wine. And then I say, hey, I'll pay a bit of it. And then when my son comes in 30 years with his bride, just give him the bill then. We call that the intergenerational dine and dash. And our development pattern resembles that type of pattern very well, unfortunately. And so this is my community in Ladner, British Columbia. Here, what I want to highlight is the fact that we actually want to learn from the question of how did older communities back in the day sustain themselves and build lasting prosperity in their communities. You can see evidence of this sometimes in the things that we don't see here. We don't see a fully developed streetscape, although I would give a lot for those boardwalks. But on the way, what we see is that there's this careful use of scarce resources, including one of the most vital bits of resources, which is the land. In Ladner at that time, there was a lot of land available, and yet they chose to stick themselves next to each other. Very deliberately. There was a recognition we cannot space out the work of building economic prosperity. We concentrate that activity, and that's how we create great places. And we can even see this in the traditional development pattern. This is the plat of Ladner back in the day when there was a determination, let's prepare this space as a village, as a community. And in this context, you can see how the lot sizes begin to get larger as you went further away from the site of economic activity. In our communities today, we actually try to do the opposite. We stick large sites out at the outskirts, and those are the ones that we subsidize, and then we wonder why we're failing in the core of our communities. Instead, we need to concentrate our wealth-building activities so that, and ask this question of your communities, are you seeing, even in some of the smaller places, the assemblies of increasingly independent neighborhoods? You can actually reflect on this in the way that certain neighborhoods in your community have names that have stood the test of time, you live in Kelowna, or you live in Kamloops, or in Sicamous, and there's little pockets. And yet, we also see so many of these nameless, faceless, developer-driven communities. Weeping Fox, for example, would be the thing. What is the joke? You always name the development after the thing that you had to exile out of there. That is often the case, what we see in our places. And it's this turning away from what it took to build lasting prosperity in our communities. And again, at Strong Towns, we're not just being traditionalists for the sake of being traditionalists. We're saying, how do we learn from what city-making people for thousands and thousands of years, across all kinds of different cultures and ethics and habitats, have done? And what we see is incremental growth, driven by local needs, or in rapid response to local needs, rather than waiting and waiting and waiting before we finally do something, which is call for a study, and then call for a consultant to come in and tell us what we already determined in the study. No, in that case, what we need is to be driven by local needs and create more opportunities through proximity. And the way that we characterize this is that in the North American context, we've become very practiced at building complicated neighborhoods, but not complex ones. They are complicated as in they have many parts, but they are all expected to be laid out in just such an order with very little of the complexity or the messiness or the work of many, many, many hands in shaping and refining it. Many of our planning departments, for reasons of having a limited amount of time, would rather get a proposal for 18 new homes like on the right than to have Uncle Albert say, I'd like to build something funky in my backyard. Funky, no. Even though you go to most of our great communities, great cities, and you say, those are the spaces where very curious, interesting things emerged, and over time we adapted to that and began to cherish those same sites in that context. And so actually, just to pick up on that a little longer, one of the things that we notice in the context of when something is complicated is that it will function until it breaks. And part of our message and what we'll see in the financial components of our communities is that we're starting to see that breakage. But in contrast, a complex thing, imagine like a rainforest compared to a farm field, a cornfield. In a rainforest, as conditions begin to shift, new species begin to emerge. New species are competing for resources, but also helping and sustaining other types of resources. In contrast with a farm field where all of the inputs are measured. I say this as a farm kid, so I know what the process looked like. All of the inputs are measured, and then you can expect a certain amount of output. And if you get anything in that balance wrong, you get failure. Instead of recognizing it as a rainforest does, that over time, even failure helps it to become more robust, more capable, strengthening, even adapting to changing climate and all of these different types of things. And so one of the challenges that we face, and we continue to communicate to people who have that nagging sense that we've started on a different path than maybe we should be on, is that we traded complexity and adaptability for pure growth and predictability. And so we are struggling with this, and we've done this through policy, through subsidies, through a flurry of construction that resulted in a dramatically simplified method of building out our cities. We actually describe this as the suburban experiment. So it's a significant bet on doing things differently. After the Second World War, I could give a whole other talk, especially on the context of housing and how this has brought about the significant spike in housing prices and scarcity that we're seeing right now. But the suburban experiment was a radical departure from the traditional development pattern. And it really rested on the idea that we should build entire neighborhoods out all at once and to a finished state. This was the equivalent of leaving them in a state of persistent adolescence. These guys are great, but they need to grow up. And yet so many of our neighborhoods, as we say at Strong Towns, no neighborhood should be subject to radical change, but also, and ask if this applies in your community, no neighborhood should be exempt from change. And yet, as so often we would see, there was none of the work of thickening up our neighborhoods, seeing them grow horizontally, yes, but also vertically to actually build greater capacity within our communities. Instead, saying, no, let's just leave them in that state. And as a consequence, struggling to find sufficient prosperity as a result of this. And so again, just to summarize, the suburban experiment here is in Ladner. If you go down the street, you can actually find almost the same site. There would be one more home that's been plucked in, but otherwise it's largely still the same. An entire neighborhood built all at once to a finished state, leaving a significant infrastructure bill with it. And so I want to illustrate, if I didn't put Brainerd, you might have guessed I picked a central BC image here. There are so many of these different types of communities, but let's illustrate what we mean by the traditional development pattern for a moment. The traditional development pattern probably plays itself out in many of your communities as well. Is you started with simple structures. You started with just gravel or dirt. You started with a bunch of people making small bets that if they could build on their investment here, they'd be in for a little and maybe get a little more out. If one guy went broke because of his gambling debts, another person would seize the opportunity and maybe they would do something with it. But within 24 years, Brainerd had grown up. Brainerd left its adolescence and in 24 years was able to move into that next stage of young adulthood. So you could say they bought a stroller and found a wife and did a few other things along the way. But in this context, notice what happened. They took simple, modest structures and said, now that we have confidence that our community is worth investing in, we're going to do things with this space. We're going to build and locate more and more opportunity in this area. You can see the way where just a little bit later, by 1930, the main street had continued to extend. There was now greater amounts of public investment bolstering the private investment that was occurring here, so that the private investment of people saying, I'm willing to invest in my community, led the way to greater amounts of public investment in this community as well. And here's what it looks like today. Oh, there we go. More public investment. That's a better street. That is a highly engineered drainage system. It's a remarkable crosswalk. Well, not so remarkable, but far less economic activity on that site. Far less of that economic activity that justifies and actually allows for the amount of private or public investment that goes into this space. And this was that shift. This is what the suburban development pattern proponents said, we need more of this. Parking readily available. Make your streets wider so that way more vehicles can pass through more rapidly. Make your spaces fit to the standard that is sent down from the gods, and yet removes the capacity for just building incrementally, developing with the resources that we have on hand. How many of your communities actually have the same story? How many of your communities have many of the same types of streets? And so I want to illustrate this in terms of just the sheer, this might be one of those things where you look at it and you say, I look at how much money went into the crosswalk and into this engineering of the streets and things like this. Most other people are like, well, I like the other one. I don't like this one. That just makes aesthetically, or maybe morally, they say, oh, we should live in beautiful places and that's less beautiful. For us at Strong Towns, one of the ways, and as city officials, you have to do this all the time, you have to reach people with arguments that they can be reached with. And that may not be a moral argument, it may not be an aesthetic argument, but oftentimes a financial argument will reach them. And in this context, we can use the example of how we compare cars. If we compare cars, we can say which one is the most efficient, and it would be this tiny little BMW. I've never seen one of those in the wild, but it looks pretty cool, and it goes a long ways on a very limited amount of gas. Which means for a limited amount of input, you get a significant amount of output, as in distance or kilometers traveled. Very differently, you could say, if I were to put a slip tank on the back of that Ford F-150, I could get further than that little BMW or even the Prius. But I would definitely not have done so more effectively. And I would have to use a lot more resources. And if you're hauling a load, it might be justified in doing that, or you just want the thrill of driving in a truck rather than whatever that thing is. That might be the case. But on the question of how valuable are we seeing, how much value can we derive from something in terms of how far we get with how little that we have to put in, we can ask this question of our cars. Well, what if we did this in our communities? Here in Merritt, we've got this tiny little, it's changed hands a bunch of different times. It's across from the hotel, right on Kilchenna. One of the things that we advocate every city to do, and again, I did this in about 20 minutes, so you can do this as well, is do a value per acre analysis of your communities. As in, if each lot or if each activity were to occupy the same amount of land, how productive or effective is that land use? Because when we face it, land is a finite resource. Yes, some of you might have ambitions to annex more land around you, but then you're going to be obligated for all of the maintenance, all of the upkeep of that land. But generally speaking, our community cores cannot simply suddenly double in size. There is no way to make the land that we're standing on actually just double in the amount that we have. It's a finite resource. And so in this question, or what the question comes up is, are we using it well? So here is a 0.14 acre site. Its value is $498,000, less than half of a house and a storage shed in Ladner right now. But in that context, this means this is a property that somebody scraping together some money with a few friends is able to buy. There's plenty of opportunities in that economic exchange to participate in this, and it comes in at $3.5 million per acre. That's its general sort of value on a per acre basis. And I also was able to crunch the numbers. This little business contributes $69,000 a year in taxes to the community, which are vital. Just go up the street just a little bit. The UK Spice Cuisine, offering Greek, Italian, and Indian, 0.14 acre site, slightly more intensive land use, not significantly more, just a second story, and even then it's only part of a second story. $510,000, $3.6 million per acre, $57,000 a year in taxes. Then we've got our little cruising style. Again, same size of block. Remember the image I showed you of the Ladner Plat, how each of those units were focused on creating activity at the street level. This is a $2.9 million per acre on this site. If you added a second story, it would be significantly more valuable. Again, $56,000 a year. 1899, this is the Coldwater Hotel, $1.9 million per acre. And I was puzzled by this because it's a 3-story structure, but you can see off to that side that a significant portion of what used to be there was scraped away in order to create parking spaces. A lot of what used to be productive activity has since been removed in order to allow for more parking. And the question is, what have we done to the development pattern? We've actually dropped its value, its efficiency as a site. But let's go on in here in Merritt. That's only $30,000, so we're half the amount of property tax on a per acre basis as some of your other very simple structures here in Merritt. EW, just up the street here, $1.9 million per acre on a 0.67 site. Again, at $1.3 million, to buy that site, it actually requires significantly more, but we're still talking about half of the amount of value as you're seeing created in your downtown area. And then we've got Walmart. Walmart comes in at $1.4 million per acre, a fraction of the amount of what we see in the other sites, even though it's worth $12.7 million. And this, I always joke that from Lethbridge, well, I grew up in Lethbridge, and in Lethbridge we always said, we have arrived if we get an Olive Garden. But a lot of our communities really had that sense, we've arrived if we gain the attention of out-of-province, out-of-country employers and businesses that are willing to come locate here. So you've got your Boston Pizza, your Best Western. We're doing development in the way that they say that we should, and it pales in comparison to what we used to do. Now, notice, the Jets, or not the Jetsons, the Waltons, when they fly in from Bentonville, they show up with $241,000. We say, hey, thank you so much. The reality is, that's not even half of what they could be contributing to the community if they were developing the site in a much more effective way. And so the question is, how do we make sites like this 2.5 times more productive? How do we make more of our existing resources? How do we prevent, and if you touch on that in a moment as well, how do we prevent some of the seepage of potential value, some of the potential value in our communities? As in to say, if we know that this, which is fairly newly built, is not creating as much value in our community, why do we continue to make this type of development the norm or the standard by which we expect that much of our future growth is going to be occurring? Simultaneously, why do we make it so difficult for our downtown businesses to do simple things like add an extra story? Or go and just tweak things, refine things. We're always looking for scrape the entire property and then put up something new and make sure there's tons of parking. But one of the things that we recognize is that parking doesn't generate the economic activity that sites and businesses and activities always do. I joked when I was out in Cranbrook just over the weekend that a t-shirt for Cranbrook could be, "Cranbrook, I came here for the parking." And we know that that's not actually the case, right? We know that people generally want to come to places that are thriving, that are active. And so one of the things that we're campaigning for across North America is to remove the parking mandates on the recognition that there's always a market requirement for parking. If you have parking battles in your community, put this away for later. There's always a market requirement for parking. That's the case. The property owner has to determine how much parking to provide. But that does not mean that the municipality should be imposing its own municipal requirements, which we frequently get really, really wrong, and have no flexibility, as well as putting the obligation on the community to suffer with less capacity in our community if we get those numbers wrong, if we keep the parking standards too high. Farmers markets in Delta, we close down our entirety of Delta Street. We take away all those parking spaces and we have amazing farmers markets that people flock to. They want to be there. And it's not because of the parking spaces. It's because of the effective, efficient use of land. And to illustrate this a little bit further, the folks at Urban 3 did an analysis of Cochrane, Alberta. So it's not a BC reference, but it's in Cochrane, not far from us. And they said, hey, as a community, we've been building out our new downtown. We're trying to do more comprehensive development in these areas, so there's multi-story residential there and some commercial. But they had this nagging sense that even with all of this new investment, that they weren't actually doing the types of things that were generating lasting value compared to what their ancestors did. And again, I showed this in Merritt, I showed this in Kimberley, I can show this in each of your communities. This is not, if you say, oh, the one that is more productive must be the one with the towers, must be the one, there's a Jimmy Petersman there that's just like handing out money on the street corner. Like, no, none of that. It's just a more compact, comprehensive development pattern that actually captures and stores wealth in our communities. Main Street Commercial has that capacity in so many of our spaces. I'll go through these rather rapidly, but this is in Tsawwassen. The Beach Grove Cafe, again, Lower Mainland numbers, $13.2 million per acre. We had another coffee shop, 14.6. As we're getting closer to the town center, we get a little bit tighter, and now we've got a building that was built up to the road. It's making full use of the lot for $25 million an acre. And then we get Jimmy Patterson's, I forgot McDonald's, half that, $6.7 million per acre, even though Lois Jackson, our mayor, insisted that it meet architectural design standards. I would have preferred that they said meet lot use standards. But I digress, because much of that space is used for parking, but it doesn't even do as good of a job of generating value in our communities as a self-storage. If you ask me, which do you think is going to produce more value for your community, my answer would not be the self-storage, and yet here it is. But it's just a little bit more even than right in our town center, our shopping center. And again, you can run these numbers, but $8.2 million for the Save on Foods. This is a significant 4.5-acre site. Or across the street, if you take a look in Tsawwassen right now, we're having a raging dispute over the redevelopment of the Tsawwassen Town Center. But one of the reasons we have to do this is because we're using 7 acres that is prime land for transit. We've got police service, we've got fire service, we have a library right there. We have invested so many significant amounts of public dollars into making this space functional, and yet it returns half of what the other sites, or actually less than half of what the other sites in our community are capable of producing because of the shift in land use pattern. This is a tiny little convenience store, one of those little old rare breeds that we have in our communities. This little convenience store, here, I'll show you the map, is right tucked up against the US border. So it serves such a small portion of our community, has a very small customer base, and yet returns the same amount of value on a per acre basis as the thing that we've stuck right in the core of our community. And it raises the question, how do we become more valuable? Again, another quick set of numbers, and then we'll move into another section of this. But this is Medicine Hat. Big box stores. This is what it looks like when you get your Olive Garden, and your community says, we've made it. Our economic development team say, we've attracted outside investment. Success. $1.9 million per acre. Compare that to their sugar daddy. Their sugar daddy comes in at $6.1 million per acre. And so I'm like, your sugar daddy treats you better than the big box stores that you said actually are the thing that you prefer more. And we keep doing this to ourselves. We keep looking in Medicine Hat in particular. They said, oh man, there's problems in the downtown. We have some visible homelessness. We have other issues that are going on. Man, if only, downtown is just not happening. I said, downtown is your money pot. It is where your wealth is stored compared to the money pits that you've created on the outskirts of your communities. And we see this over and over and over again. And out of this, what we had, I had a call that was left for me. Again, for the folks that have not heard of Strong Towns, maybe you're starting to feel this way. Tim from Wisconsin left a message. He said, is Strong Towns a cult? And being a pastor, I was like, oh, I'm very interested in this question. And so I called him up, and Tim said, look, I've been for decades a builder in Wisconsin, and I would do very simple projects for farmers. I would do very simple projects for municipalities. My construction company would work with private owners. We would do these careful investments in order to build wealth in the space. So it was often a lot of modifications and renovations and things like this. He said, when I would be tasked by the municipal authorities to build structures, it'd be very simple stuff like this. We would use scarce public resources very wisely. And he said, even if we built slightly more significant structures, we made sure that they were, at the street, making good use of that land. And he said, I turned my business over to my son, and I'm really proud of him on the one side because he quadrupled the size of the business. But he said every one of their projects is funded by outside money. Every one of it requires a grant from a federal or state level government. Every one of them requires bonds in order to be able to go forward. He said, how is it that we've lost sight of what it takes to build lasting prosperity? And the cult part of it was, he said, I've been having these thoughts for a long, long time and deeply worried about where we're going. And then I started hearing Strong Town stuff on the podcast and just said, whoa, they're talking the stuff that I've been thinking. Either I've descended off the cliff, or this is that type of common sense questioning of what it takes to build lasting prosperity that really matters. And we agree that in so many ways we've lost sight of what it takes to build enduring prosperity. When the things that we now look to, like the big box stores in Medicine Hat, that pale in comparison, are three to four times less productive on a per acre basis than that old stuff, the rundown stuff, the sugar daddies in the cheesecake world. And out of this, the impact for you is that we, depending on our political preferences, are going to look at taxation and say, out of our private wealth, we are willing to take a fraction of that in order to build public investments, to invest in the commonwealth, to pay taxes. And your political alignments will tell you how much of that you want that fraction to be, but there is that recognition. We need to have private capacity from which we can take a fraction or a portion of it in order to be able to fund public investments. And so, much of the work of building strong, healthy communities through the public purse relies on and is necessary to be kindled by strong amounts of private wealth. And the trouble that we have here in Delta, or in my community in Delta, is that for every $3 of our private assets, and you can do this if you go to BC Assessments and see how much the private assessment total for your community is, and then compare that against the book of assets that your community has taken on. Your roads, your sewers, your streets, your community centers, for us, our diking infrastructure, all of these types of things. And in Delta, the trouble that we're in is that for every $3 of private wealth, so there's wealth in Delta, but that is requiring us to then try to somehow keep up at least $1 of public investment along the way, and we can't do it. A better ratio at minimum is $20 or even $40 for every $1 of public investment. And this is when the accountant from BDO says, hey, you're stretched. Hey, your revenues are really stretching the capacity that you have to be able to cover the many costs that you have. In Delta, we've given up on the idea that we're going to fix our dike. We're just waiting for either a flood or for a ferry in Ottawa to send us money. The flood is likely, but the ferry is unlikely. That's the challenge that we face. And so when we ask this question, have we lost sight of what it takes to build lasting prosperity? We can see this in the way the communities began to grow. This is an example out of Fresno. You see that compact urban core thickening up, developing, even in the midst of the Great Depression, allowing for some horizontal expansion. But if you went and looked at a height map of the community, much of that activity that is generating greater capacity with existing assets. And then we lost the plot after the Second World War. This is what it looks like in Kansas City, 82,000 up to 145,000. So that you increase your population, and a lot of our communities desperately want to grow, have more people. You should grow and improve as a community if you simultaneously manage to make much better use of what you already have, and most of our cities are not doing that. They are now responsible for 30 feet of sewer pipe per person, and the trouble is, when it's their birthday, they don't get that pipe in their hand. That is just pipe that's in the ground that they have to keep up, that they're obliged to. And it's even worse in places that are struggling with population decline. So this is South Bend, Indiana. As a part of trying to pursue growth and rapidly grow, they increased their lift station capacity, they increased their miles of force main, and yet they saw a significant reduction in their population, leaving them deeply vulnerable and on the course to insolvency in their community. And so the challenge that we have is that we've increasingly went from a system where we could cover many things with cash reserves. Again, I was just chatting with an accountant who said a lot of our communities struggle to even keep a bare reserve available. We don't have that available, then turning to bond markets, turning eventually to insolvency in this context. There we go. Ever so quickly, I took a look at a community in Mount Vernon, Washington. The Skagit Valley Food Co-op took up 0.22 acres. So I said, let's compare the Walmart versus the food co-op. If you were to build out both of these in your communities, your Walmart would bring in $327,000. You'd be like, thank you to the Bentonville Bros. Meanwhile, the Skagit Valley Food Co-op, they show up with a paltry $27,000. But what happens if you were to occupy at the same amount of economic activity a site with the same economic activity as the Skagit Valley Food Co-op? You would only require a portion of that 27-acre site, which raises the question, what else could you have in your community? I drew an image there of the Mount Vernon downtown little area and said, if it is all as productive as the Skagit Valley Food Co-op, which it largely is, it is contributing far more to the core capacity of the community. And so if we ask this question, that 327, the first one without the red, is what Walmart is giving, and probably the same, similar numbers here in Merritt. And yet, when we say, by changing the development pattern, how much have we left on the table? How much have we simply said, that's all right, we don't need that. We desperately need that. And we desperately need to regain our capacity to be able to build lasting prosperity in our communities. And to illustrate this again, this is transit-oriented development, hot term in Winnipeg, the seasons of tuxedo. I bet it's amazing. It is Winnipeg, though. But in this context, this is transit-oriented development. This is the new stuff that we are building. Let's compare it to what traditional development in Winnipeg looks like. This is the Exchange District. This is what our ancestors knew to do, situate things closely together, build in more compact and vertical ways in order to do great stuff for the community, have a beating economic heart, know where your money pot is, so that way you can continue to foster this. Remember the example of Cochrane. Their little neglected downtown area actually had buildings and properties that were far more economically capable than sites within 5 minutes of downtown Calgary, because of the development pattern that they had adopted. And we see this in Winnipeg, we see this in so many places. If you're interested in this, if this is just scratching the surface, I always say that the infrastructure part and the financing is the least interesting, most important things for us to talk about. But if you're interested, I would definitely recommend this book, You'll Pay for This, looking at Winnipeg, but also other places coming out in just a moment here. But the challenge that we have as we come up on 34 minutes here is that we're good at paying for new growth, but we struggle to maintain what we build. It's actually to the point where growth creates an illusion of wealth. At first, local governments enjoy high revenues. When I worked in the mayor's office for Diane Watts, we had record amounts of DCCs coming in and permit fees, and it paid for all the free lunches that I got to enjoy in the mayor's office. And yet, all of that was layering up new massive amounts of obligations that the community is now struggling to maintain in their spaces. And so the BC government is alert to this. do check out the Community Lifecycle Cost Calculator. It is a beefy Excel spreadsheet, but communities that have used it, Prince George among them, really began to parse the numbers and look much more with scrutiny at the types of developments that are occurring. Places like Cranbrook, where you know that the obligations to establish a new neighborhood up in the hills are significantly higher than when you can actually do neighborhood investment within your communities. And maybe just a quick note there, what we often call infill, that's planner speak. I always say infill sounds like something you get at the dentist. When we talk to residents, we need to say what we are encouraging is neighborhood investment, encouraging people to invest in their neighborhood and inviting new people to invest in our existing neighborhoods and making them stronger, lest we lose sight of what it takes to build enduring prosperity. And so what are some of the defining features of these sites, the Cochrane downtown, the Merritt downtown, the Kimberley downtown, that are so vital? And what can we do to even capture even more value in our spaces? Perhaps this is in your community if you have a main street, even just one, where people do like to gather. This is an example out of Idaho Springs in Colorado. They just said all of the perpendicular streets we're going to open up to people, businesses could put stuff into the street. They said, kids, go ahead and play in these spaces. They opened up those streets. And they kept all of the parallel streets as travel streets. Most of your communities could get away with this. It would provoke a little bit of a revolution for a bit, but over time what you would see is that in these spaces, all of a sudden people that were on foot had a much simpler path to navigate. They were only looking for traffic from one angle or from two angles as they passed through, and yet businesses still had access. There was still parking available. There was still space, and yet they designed for people, even as they sought to, in various ways, accommodate cars. And they allowed the spaces to mature as well. And this is something each of you really need to be in the habit of doing, is saying, not only do we want to get the plan right and then to perfectly execute on that plan, no, figure out how do you allow spaces like to mature. At first, business owners were like, well, I mean, can we just leave the chairs out? And the city said, I mean, you could try. So they tried and nobody took them. And so they just made it happen. In the city of Delta, we did some open streets where we created little pop-up parklets. And one of my favorite conversations that we had, or that I overheard, was a bunch of boys that saw a ping pong table there, and the paddles were there, and the balls were there, and they're like, are we allowed to use these? And I was like, yeah, go for it. And they're like, but what if somebody takes them? And I was like, then they'll just get more. And it's part of a pattern of saying, with small amounts of investment, we can actually really enliven our spaces. For the cost of a ping pong paddle and a ball, we'll be fine if some of that walks off. The irony being that the next year they did it much closer to the water and everybody chucked the golf clubs into the river. That wasn't good, but the context of it was saying, let's iterate, let's learn from failure, let's identify how do we allow our spaces to mature. This is Kimberley. I was just there on Saturday and just blown away by the way in which they recognized a really good strategy for your downtown areas in particular, to even build more capacity in your spaces, was to distinguish the entire area of your downtown as being a performance space, as being an experience zone. And it's a great way for local businesses to really begin to think about their role as extras in the play or participants in putting on a performance for the community, such that they said many of our spaces we need to really treat as being on stage, and then there'll be some spaces that are just off stage, and that's fine. But what it allowed them to do was look past just their mere responsibility just for their little location and say, we're all part of this. We all want to make our spaces thrive. And out of this, what we say at Strong Towns is that when it comes to investing scarce resources, we really need to push back on the idea that we should simply wait and get ready for big grant opportunities to come our way, or just wait until finally we've accumulated so much need that we can then basically justify spending as much as we need to in order to take care of all of those problems. Even when I was in the minister's office in Ottawa, handling some of the responsibilities for shovel-ready projects in 2008, one of the questions was, what is a shovel-ready project? And the answer is, it's a project that nobody else was willing to pay for. It's those projects that basically finally got up to the minister's office, and it was like, if the feds are going to cover it, then we're good. And in contrast, Strongtown says, each of us has the ability to humbly observe where people in the community struggle, and then ask the question, what's the next smallest thing we can do right now to address that struggle? And then go and do that thing. I'll tell you a story. The city of Brainerd, Minnesota, which actually Strongtown started there, so that's part of why we know of the story. There was a little area behind the library, and it was not well used. It was all run down. And they said, hey, let's turn it into a parklet. So they applied for a grant. And they got a $60,000 grant to study the design for this space. And so they gave an architect $60,000, and they came back with a design for a $160,000 public art installation / public space. And they said, but we don't have $160,000, and we certainly aren't going to spend it on what he came up with. And so the librarian said, well, I've got a different idea. I noticed that actually what people want to do there is just sit. So she sanded down the picnic tables, and they had a spring plant sale, and they actually said, let's host a plant sale at the library, and any of the leftovers, like the hostas and other things like that, any of the leftovers, we'll just plant them all around here. And just with what they had, they created that great public space, and suddenly it was suitable for kids to read in, for children to play in, for all of those different types of things. Very different from the standard way that a lot of our communities approach these questions. Shifting gears a little bit, I want to touch on just ever so quickly the impact that trees have on our stormwater systems. This is one of the things that we can do to improve our downtowns, really from the question of just the pure finances. Again, not making a moral argument about the spotted owl, not making an aesthetic argument about isn't it nice to be surrounded by trees. That matters. But let's just talk numbers. Stick a sponge on top of another sponge, it'll soak up a lot more water. And so in the context of Springfield, Missouri, they identified a single tree intercepts 770 gallons of rainfall and absorbs 1,500 in its roots every single year. Out of that, if you apply that to the total tree canopy, they were capturing 13 million above ground, 35 million below ground, capturing and storing and preventing it from running off or overwhelming their storm sewers, which meant that this was reducing their stormwater system costs by $600,000 up top, $1.6 million downtown, or downstairs, I should say. And the benefit on a per tree basis was significant, even after you factored in a very healthy amount of tree care and maintenance. We often struggle, and we're like, well, maybe we should get rid of the forester. They just deal with, tree buds and aphids and things like this. No, these are the people that are storing wealth in your community so that the community was becoming wealthier as a consequence of having a healthy, established tree networks. And the benefit also is that creates great spaces for people, spaces that people want to gather in. This is in Fargo, North Dakota, and I just found this such a striking image. If you compare what it was to what it became, that is our two different development patterns. And the core thing is the recognition that the city's engineers pushed back on what they wanted to do with Broadway. They pushed back saying, no, you can't do that. Bump outs don't work. Why do you do a bump out? To make it safer for people to be there. Why do you bring back street parking? To clog up the arteries through your downtown so it's easier and better to just simply go into your downtown rather than try to pass through it. Other traffic slowing devices that would cause major gridlock. In contrast, what they did to the other street on Main was to simply raise it of all of its life, of all of its capacity. And someone made the point, no one I spoke to could say exactly how we had decided to prioritize cars over people. Two of the same streets, and we changed them significantly. We see this in Ladner. We just had an opportunity. The whole street was dug up. We had a moment to humbly observe that many people struggled with the placement of those BC Hydro posts. And yet, in a very orderly way, we put everything back just the way it was. Pains me. And we didn't even pave this little desire path that was there. That is part of our responsiveness as city leaders, taking on the responsibility to do simple things in order to make our spaces healthier. We could have done simple things like water catchment areas with seating, all sorts of different things to make our spaces more vibrant and more dynamic. Calgary started to figure this out with very simple use of these concrete dividers. Woo. I get fired up about dividers, tell me. Yeah. And then bollards? Oh boy. But let's make sure I'm still on. Yeah, I should be. All right. Very simple. And what they were doing is re-engineering those streets without having to repave the curve, repave the curbs and all of that. They didn't have to do anything with drainage, but suddenly they made their spaces all that much more effective. We say at Strongtowns, both are 30-kilometer zones, but only one of them is designed like it. And we can ask the question, if you have a site like what you see up top, Kamloops has lots of them. I was just there a while back. Do what Montreal's done. Bring in simple things right at those openings wherever you have intersections. Again, this is a more established treatment, but you can do that with the simple stuff that Calgary was doing already in this space. Because I say, one of the things that we care as a driver, just instinctively, even though we are a good person, when it comes to the actual way in which we conduct ourselves in a vehicle, is we often care more for our mirrors than for minors. We may love children. We may really value their lives. And yet, so often, just the natural instinct is, oh, this is a street that I can go at a significant speed at. I'm not going to get clipped. I'm not going to get scratched. Why do you slow down in a parking lot? Because you might get clipped. You might get scratched. Why do you pull way over to the side when a bus is coming by? Because you don't want to lose your mirror. Why do we not slow down in elementary schools? Because we care more for our mirrors and we're not worried about risking them than deep down, sort of instinctively, to recognize that we have this responsibility to our children in so many different ways. And so we have seen many people say, hey, slow down or drive like your children live here. To every civic leader here, bring this challenge back to your staff. Let's design our streets like our children live here. It doesn't take that much infrastructure. We can do this because if we need a sign to tell people to slow down, we've designed the street wrong. It's a problem of dimensions, not a problem of human behavior in this context. I know that I'm coming up on my time here, so I want to just highlight the fact as well that across our communities, one of the things that we have learned to do is design for vehicles and then try to figure out ways to accommodate people. And it's often done in the sense of we need to alleviate congestion. In Lethbridge, congestion is when there's 3 cars stacked instead of 2 at the traffic light at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Anticipating that if the peak reaches a certain amount, then we need significant changes to the way that we have designed these things. And yet one of the things that we should reflect on is what is it that causes congestion? Well, it is slowing. So if vehicles are on a highway, they're all moving at pace. The only thing that will cause them to get backed up is when there's sudden slowing because of deer or a beautiful vista or a crash or whatever that is. And then even more, stopping really causes people to get backed up. So those tight little turns into driveways or things like this. But if you ask the question, what creates prosperous places? Isn't it slowing to... oh man, it's more dramatic when it actually works. Slowing to notice and then stopping to engage. That's actually what we want to be seeing in our spaces. Any place worth going to is going to have congestion because when you think about it, the entire purpose of a city is to create congestion. Ever since the first business people decided to set up a brothel or a saloon or a church, as it followed, on the side of a well-used ox cart, the only goal has been to get people to stop. And yet the suburban development pattern, through its assumption of everyone being reliant on a vehicle, as well as excluding by class and being resistant to change, has really messed with this. And so we say and insist, congestion is the price that we pay for nice things in our spaces. How do we create that congestion then? If you say we actually lack economic vitality in our communities, one of the things that you can do is experiment with small, simple things like what Muskegon, Michigan did, where they took storage sheds and they beefed them up. They made them a little bit cuter. Cute is always good in most of our communities. And they took them and set them 8 in a row right next to a city-owned parking lot. And it was at the extension of where their downtown sort of petered out. And the trouble in their downtown in Muskegon was that nobody was renting at the rates that the landlords needed in order to keep them open. There was no economic activity at that grassroots sort of fine-grained level. And so they said, all right, we're going to open these up. And they served new businesses, and people popped up and said, hey, I'm going to try something. And if Jim here had to go to get his hip replaced, somebody next door could help him and just watch his shop for a while. Out of it, every one of those ended up in the downtown. And a whole new wave of more began to populate into these spaces. You have this amount of people that are able to actually start to build economic activity in your spaces. The trouble is we often make it so difficult for them to get their start. So difficult. I was speaking with the Mike from the guitar shop in Sicamous about the challenges of getting going. We often say that the quota of how much brain damage you have to go through in order to get your first business started or to modify your existing business needs to be lowered. We need to make this simple. We need to lower the bar of entry in our community. Even as we allow more commercial in our residential areas, I want to highlight, because I actually think this touches on a lot of what we have going on in our communities, and then we'll wrap, is the recognition that a lot of what we call in our slightly larger communities mixed-use zoning is actually still just stacked, segregated uses. We're still insisting on this very top-down assumption that we know what belongs where. So you can have retail ground level, yes, and then residential up top, but could you put a doctor's office in the top suite? No. Could you put a Filipino market into a home not in the space that it was occupying near Joyce Station when the development or the building that they were in, it was up for redevelopment, this core of their community, right next to the church, near the Immigrant Settlement Society, that building, where could it go? It couldn't go to any of the property owners around and say, hey, can we take over your main floor of your house? We're going to set up a grocer right in this space. We're going to stay where we are. How many of your spaces or how many of your communities allow for the gradual bleeding of store and retail opportunities into other spaces within your community? Where did they go? An industrial site. And the business closed, and the community suffered as a consequence. And yet, our ancestors, when we learn from them, this is in Ladner across the street, not in the commercial zone, but it's where you can get your, I think it's a tax office or a law office. I fortunately haven't been in trouble with the law, and I do my own taxes, so I haven't been there yet. But we see this taking over of spaces, and it was normal. And the reality is it's in your power to allow this. And so we need safe streets, but also productive streets. And I'm going to blitz through just to close out here a moment. I was a preacher. I always had at least 45 minutes, but I also recognize that we do want to leave a bit more time here for questions. But I want to just close with the idea that when I touched on the idea that we need to rebuild our capacity for building prosperity, I've just begun to sort of scratch the surface of that, but I hope like those scratches, you start to sort of itch at that, begin to ponder it, begin to see different elements in your own community where maybe you're leaving wealth on the table, the capacity to build local wealth. But one of the things that I'm super excited about is that we have groups of people, residents. These are just concerned citizens, oftentimes working with council members or working with elected or with technical staff, and they're getting together in over 2,600 communities that they're getting trained in how to shape and shift the conversations that are occurring in our communities. In the form of, right now, we have over 284 places in North America where people are regularly getting together. In my community, the group that I lead, Del Pop, we've been advocating for a lot of the changes, and we had city council members that came up to us and said, for the first time, we've been able to have the conversation at the doorstep with a resident who's all up in arms and says, nobody wants this. And they're like, well, actually, read the paper. There's a whole group of young people and old people that do want this. And we're encouraging so many of our local conversation groups to be active, engaging in shaping the conversations within their communities to be able to bring about this change. The prevailing pattern of development is making our places weak and fragile, but we are seeking to change that. We've lost sight of what it takes to build enduring prosperity, but we can get this back. And so I'd challenge you and encourage you, take note of the resources, continue as you press on, humbly observe where people are struggling, and then identify what is the next smallest thing we can do to address that struggle. And as you go out, I've shared just the bottom one below the book is a resource page for a whole bunch of resources and extra articles and things like that related to this talk. Or if you inadvertently scan the big one, that's the one to join as a Strong Towns member, or you can just join our email list, all sorts of ways to stay connected. But I'm so grateful for your time, especially right after lunch. You've been a great group to be able to share this with, and I would love to invite your questions. So thank you so much. Thank you. Please. Yeah, so I think a key part of it is to say that the private side, like all of the private investment areas, so all the private property, to really work closely with those individual property owners or even the tenants in those spaces and say, what more can you do in this area, and what more can you do to generate investment in your existing property if we make it a little bit easier for you. So we're going to roll out some removal of some of the restrictions, or we're going to expedite the planning side to allow for that, because we often will try to pick winners or say, hey, we don't like that type of use, so go and in my city right now, we're trying to determine exactly where the hotel has to go. Actually, from a Strong Towns perspective, that's a decision for private property owners to make, whether or not they can justify investing in a hotel and being responsible for it if it goes belly up or if it is a success. The flip side of it is, especially in a downtown area, the whole idea of saying, if this was your living room, what would you like to see? If this was your gathering space, what would you like to see? And that will often look like, well, I wish it wasn't quite so loud. We know how to make a street a little quieter. You slow the cars. So there's some very simple strategies. It doesn't mean that everyone has to be, walking through your downtown. You don't have to close every street to vehicles, but you definitely would be looking at things like, how do we create more patio areas? How do we create those types of zones that people can not only visit a shop, but also just visit that core area? A key part of it is attracting people to just reside or spend some time in there. That's why I loved when we were tree planting in Smithers. They have a great sort of communal core area. You just have that sense, I am welcomed here and dignified. And that's a key part of it. The other element is often the idea that we would propose is having, say you had a plan to spend $60,000 on a consultant. We've actually encouraged sometimes communities take that $60,000 and do sort of like a ranked strategy where you do a round of $500 for, I think, up to 20 contestants. My math is probably a little off. And say, what would you do with $500? And then encourage the groups that align and say, this is what we would do with our $500, give them the 500, see what they do with it, and then have the community vote on what the next group or which of those groups they'd like to see do something with 1,500. And then close it off with what would the final group do with 10,000. And what's interesting is you begin to cultivate a deep sense of that community, like, oh heck, we're 580, but I'll chip in the 80. Or, oh, don't worry about the cost of the paint supplies. I'll make sure that that's just provided for free. And it becomes a shared communal space. And that's really critical. What we've seen in Delta, when I went back and looked at the urban renewal, big plan that they had for urban renewal, they designated the vast majority of Ladner's great spaces as blight. And the only thing that blessed us was that we didn't have the money to knock it down. And so as a result, the things that you see in Ladner Village are the things that we actually still love. And it was all stuff that was supposed to go away. And that is, I'm not totally throwing out the idea that you can get some consultant from Vancouver to do good work, but they're really good at copying and pasting, and they do a lot of that throughout the interior. I chatted with a council member who said I caught them, they had forgotten to change out names. This is sometimes the thing that creates that skepticism, that sense like, why did we pay somebody else to tell us? Well, we could have figured it out ourselves. So sometimes that exercise, little contests, little challenges can really go a long ways as well. But the last thing I would say is making the good visible, even before you make it permanent. And so that might look like having a bunch of garbage cans, fill them with potting soil, put some plants in it, and say, hey, we're trying out a different type of little parklet or things like that. Before you roll in a paving crew or set up, fancy stuff, do it with very simple. If you've got straw bales, it would give me I'd start wheezing, but I'd still come out because that's the type of stuff that can actually make a big difference in creating much stronger local spaces. Yeah, so one of the things to push back on it gently to say, it's not why across every industry that every single sector is struggling. The Bay tried belatedly to get into online shopping. They were really bad at it if you ever spent any time on their site. I had lots of orders that went the wrong way. And there's a lot of that, instead of leaning into what they did exceptionally well, which was be a great department store, it was cuts after cuts after cuts after cuts. And you could see they still had stores that were profitable. They still had local stores that were a gem within the community, but there's a lot of big capital forces that were really beginning to shape that. The flip side of it is your small businesses, asking them those questions, how do you stay profitable? I think is a part of it. Some are going to be struggling. But one of the things I've actually encouraged, and if ever I open a shop of my own, what I want to do is be more transparent as a local business about how you're doing. So I would actually have a hospital thermometer on the wall of my coffee shop. At the start of the month, it'd be at 0. And it'd be as soon as we got to break even, everybody that came after that who had supported us at the start of the month earned perks. So it's like your banana loaf is half off if you supported us before we broke even, which means in February, we're all working together to get the business over. And this is the reality, I'm amazed at how tenuous and not just tenuous, how small businesses are actually able to hold on and able to nurture new markets, even as the more established retailers go out the door. It's really challenging as well. So in Chilliwack, the little organic grocer right downtown, their property tax was 14 times as much as the superstore on a per acre basis. Again, when we do that math, and so I was like, how much do we complain about a rutabaga costing more when we actually have caused it to be valued at such a higher cost and make it that much more difficult? So some are beginning to shift the balance as well as investing in those things as well. So Yeah, great question. I'm at my time, but thank you so much again. Take care, everybody.